I was prepping to lead the strategic offsite for Rackspace with 80 plus people coming from all over the US, the UK. The pressure was immense. And I felt like it was all up to me to come through. Well, the CEO suggested I hire another facilitator to help manage the load. I did, and it was a disaster.
Welcome to the Live Truly Free podcast.
So in today's podcast, what we want to dive into is there's really two possibilities as a leader. Either it's all up to you to do it, or the other possibility is you're going to share the load.
So we're not talking about knowing when to delegate or some, surface level, like you need to delegate as a leader conversation. No, this is more of a kind of like a strategic thought process behind what type of leadership style you are and how dependent your organization is on your input on everything.
Right. I think a lot of what I see on like how to delegate is what psychologists call behavior modification. And we're not going for just changing our behaviors. We're going about a deep attitude change. Am I going to be the kind of person that shares the load or not?
And that attitude kind of infects the culture of the company too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we're going to sort of something much deeper than just changing your behaviors,
Right.
Delegate this report or that. But getting back to your Rackspace story, I'm very intrigued. How did you add somebody and it made it worse? I feel like I'm kind of confused on how that can go. You think another person makes it easier.
Well, let me give some backstory. So the previous year, I was asked to do the offsite and 40 people came. And there were some founders, one founder in particular who said he wasn't going to come. And because all the previous years, the offsites were just a disaster. And why would this one be any different? Well, it wasn't. It was a smashing success. And by the next year, it was the hottest ticket in the company. Everybody wanted to try to get in on the offsite.
Was the 40-person one the first time you ran it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And the other thing was the company had almost doubled in size. So we had more leaders. And the expectations were sky high that this was going to be awesome because everybody wanted to come. So I'm feeling all this pressure. And I was in the mode of, if I don't come through, if I don't make this happen, it's not going to happen. I was part of the disaster. What was I going to do?
And so when you felt all that pressure and the CEO said, "Hey, George, maybe you might want to bring another person in," bringing in that other person's what caused the disaster, or do you think it was your response to the pressure that caused it?
So we're working two different possibilities here of leadership. One is it's all up to me to come through. Therefore, he could have added a whole team around me of facilitators and it wouldn't have worked. I wasn't sharing the load. And
what I'm thinking of when I hear this is, so I played team sports basically my entire life since I was like 5 or 6 years old. And so I feel like it's kind of ingrained in me to just naturally be able to work with and trust others and kind of think team first before trying to put all the pressure on myself to do something.
Well, let me give an example. So, and this is from ancient history. So guys, this is thousands of years ago. In other words, humans have been struggling with this for millennia. All right. So there's this guy named Moses. You might have seen a movie by Disney on Moses back in ancient Egypt. So he's led the Hebrews out into the wilderness and he's trying to solve all the problems himself. And what I love about this story is his father-in-law comes along and his father-in-law gives him fatherly advice. Moses, this is going to kill you. And all these people are just standing around doing nothing, waiting their turn to have you solve their problem. And here's the essence of what's going on. And Moses actually says this. He believes he's the only one who can solve their problems. He's the only one, in this case, who can hear God for the people.
Yeah, that's putting way too much pressure on yourself.
Now, let me add something. Moses is 80 years old. And so when he was like under 40, okay, we don't know exactly the age, it's recorded in history that he led a huge Egyptian army up against I think it was the Ethiopians and beat them. So this guy, he knew, he had played team sports. Let's just say it
Yeah.
that way. War was team sports back then, okay?
Yeah.
So it still kind of is, I guess. Nothing's really changed. So he got that.
Okay. So he got that. He still had the background and like, I know I'm strong with the team, but in this particular instance, he still felt that pressure that it has to go through me. I'm the only one who can do this. Everybody needs to come to me. And that kind of created a situation where, it's impossible to service everybody, especially if it's for between them and the relationship with God. And so were you kind of in a similar situation now that you did one successful leadership summit with 40 people and now you're doubling to 80 people, but you still feel like you have to be the one guy for all 80 of those people?
Look, I made the magic happen in the first one. I'm the magic man. And so, if I don't do it, how's it going to be magical? How's this going to work? So here's what's happening. So we've got this other facilitator guy. And by the way, he came alongside in the last few weeks before. I had never worked with him. He had never worked with me. And everyone was coming to me for everything, kind of like Moses. I discovered, I think this other facilitator guy had done offsites of like 6 to 8 people. We had 80. By day 2, I think he left. I have no idea what happened to him. To this day, I cannot remember. I did make a decision at that point, really early on, day 1. I've got to share the load. But then I had to figure out, who am I going to share it with?
Yeah. And I feel like that's very relatable to like a small business or even like a solo entrepreneur, where it's like you start feeling yourself get overwhelmed. That what you're doing is not sustainable. You're not going to be able to keep juggling all of these balls effectively. And so you're like, well, I need to find somebody else to do this. But especially if you're a solopreneur, but even if you're just on a small team, it could feel almost helpless when you're just like, well, now who do I go to? And nobody has the expertise to do this. So how am I going to get this done right?
Well, and let's go to the solopreneur. It's you. If you
Mm-hmm.
don't make the money come in, or you don't pay your bills, so it's all up to you, right? And you have no team. But that's not completely true. After leading all these companies over a period of time, I became a solopreneur. So I know this world pretty well. Well, you have to decide, am I going to share the load? If you make that decision, there are ways now that weren't available even just a few years ago, where you can outsource even just a personal assistant, where they're
Oh yeah.
handling certain aspects of what you're doing digitally online, and they might be in the Philippines, honestly. So there's ways to take little pieces of what you're doing and create some leverage so that you're sharing the load. If you're a content creator, okay, like videos, YouTube creator, and there's a lot of you guys out there, you hire an editor, and you don't have to have an editor to do the whole edit. You could just have them do a part of it. It only starts, I think, AJ, with a decision like what I made was, I got to share the load. This
Yeah.
ain't going to work.
And I think you just touched on something that we've talked about. You need to be a member of a community, whether it's in your industry or like the entrepreneurial community. By being a part of that community, you're going to have access to those connections. You're going to kind of know where you can go. I mean, virtual assistant, you find that online, of course. Maybe you can find a way to barter for other skills using the skills that you already do have as a solopreneur.
That's a great, I've done that. I've done that a lot. In
Oh, I know
fact,
you do.
yeah. And my initial branding was a barter deal. And they were a fabulous marketing branding group. And I was a fabulous CFO. They needed the financial part of me. And so we swapped. That branding took me to a whole new level, and that absolutely sharing the load.
Exactly. And you were still able to just focus on your end of things, finance and strategy,
Yep.
while building up yourself into something else, just because you were able to find the proper who.
Yeah. AJ, you're right. you've got to find the right who. So let's go back to the Moses story for a second. The fatherly advice Moses gets from his father-in-law is to find capable, honest men who fear God and hate bribes. I'm fascinated by this quote because if I'm giving characteristics of a capable person, it wouldn't occur to me to put hate bribes on the list. But here's what he's saying. Here's the fatherly advice. And this has stood the test of millennia, thousands of years, guys. So we should listen to it. It's, first of all, you're looking for capable, honest men, women, and something about being honest is different than taking bribes. And so there's a corruption that's associated with that. And then here's what the father-in-law says. They will help you carry the load and make the task easier for you. Now, there's some more stuff that goes into it, but let me just take you all the way to the results. Because he says this, the father-in-law says, the results, you will be able to endure the pressures and all these people will go home in peace. Now, let me translate that a little bit to how that could look for us. With capable, honest people who don't take bribes, you will lessen your load. You will be able to endure the pressure. So it's not that the pressure goes away. You're able to endure it, and peace will break out. The company will be at peace. The people you influence, peace will be a fruit of everything you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think Moses experienced peace. I think what he experienced was, oh,
And that's interesting that you say like it'll resonate throughout the organization. And that I feel like that's because all the employees have to notice that pressure that you're putting on yourself. And if everything has to get funneled through you, all of them are well aware that everything they do has to get approved by you. Where when you kind of share that ability, they start to feel more empowered, and they don't. And even when you make yourself that wound up and putting all that pressure on yourself, you might not even realize that you might be making yourself less approachable to your employees or those who you're working with. So they put that pressure on themselves like, okay, I have 15 minutes to pitch this idea to him and I need his approval, but he's super stressed right now. This is going to be hard to do. And then, you did that, the stress just goes down and down the line of people trying to appease you, where when you spread that out, people kind of all feel involved in the process, and it kind of creates like a harmonious piece around the company.
that's true. And that's exactly what I did at the Rackspace offsite.
Okay.
So I had already organized the offsite prior to getting there. I had done months of prep. And what I had determined was I was going to have 8 to 10 groups. And these would be working on various strategies that would all fit together and drive the overall strategy for the coming year. And so this was a way to get all the leaders involved in making strategy in the area of their expertise. So from the last offsite, I had developed really good relationship with some of the top leaders. Well,
Okay.
I knew who I had put in these groups, and I identified all those top leaders, and I just made them the leaders of these groups. Now, here's the thing. They were super capable, okay? I don't think any of them took bribes. That really wasn't on my checklist. I was just trying to get through the offsite, okay?
Yeah.
And, maybe I bribed him with an extra dessert or something, but please lead the group. Okay. And, but here's the thing. They knew me. And you're going to hear this in a minute. They knew me and they knew my process, and they believed in it because they had done it the previous year and interim little processes along the way through this last 12 months.
Oh, okay. So you found capable people who were honest and also believed. Like their mission and their goals were aligned with yours, and they bought into what you were doing as a leader. So because they bought into that, you were basically able to lead through them because they believed in what you believed in, if that makes sense.
Yes. Now, here is the key, guys. You have to mentor them. And you actually have to mentor your whole company in kind of a larger sense. But then these in my case, I needed to mentor the 80, and I did. We would have group sessions which I would lead, but then the 8 to 10, I had to mentor them specifically.
Okay.
So let me go to the fatherly advice of Moses' father-in-law. So he said to the whole group of Hebrews, and you're right, you mentioned millions. It could have been millions of people. Teach them God's decrees and give them his instructions. Show them how to conduct their lives. So you got to model. Okay. So it's modeling, it's mentoring by modeling a lifestyle.
Okay.
All right. And then he says, these men, so he's referring to those that Moses will appoint, these men will be always available to solve the people's common disputes. And then they brought the major cases to Moses, but they took care of the smaller matters themselves. So here's what's going on there. Moses trained them. He mentored them. He spent time with them. He showed them. And so if you read the whole passage and the whole story, he points some to be over groups of 10 and some over groups of 100 and some over groups of 1,000. And so what he did was he worked with these guys, and he probably mentored them to mentor the thousands, to mentor the ones over hundreds, to mentor the ones over tens, so that there's this whole teaching. So you don't just pick 8 people or 10 people to lead these groups as in this offsite. What I actually did was I had put together clear instructions and worksheets, and they already knew how this worked because they had been to the previous year. It's like, okay, before breakfast, I need to meet with you 10 guys. And so I go,
Yeah.
good. So here's what your group's going to do. And I passed out the sheets. I said, here's how the sheet works. All you need to do is just follow this sheet and then use all the brainstorming techniques that we used before at the previous offsite. So you're going to have all of those supplies at your place. We were out in the Texas Hill Country. It was a fabulous place. And so you could do groups outside or inside or whatever, and they picked where they wanted. And then we had some logistic people who helped with all the supplies and stuff. So they were all set. They were ready to go. And what I didn't realize was I had modeled all of this the previous year. They had seen it all. And so it made it super easy. All I had to do was decide in myself, am I going to be the kind of person that shares the load, or am I going to be the kind of leader that feels like I have to do it all? And when I shared the load, all the things you just described started to happen. Peace. And empowered. You empower them. I didn't know the answer that they would come up with, but I empowered them to go get an answer.
Yeah. And so basically, by saying, okay, I'm not going to be able to do this all alone, I need to spread out the load. Actually, by releasing some of that and delegating it, now you have 8 to 10 other people who are also working in line with you. So now it's not just you, it's between 9 to 11 people were doing the same exact thing. Like you've multiplied yourself.
Yeah. And so there's another dynamic that happened too. I heard the story years ago, years before all of this, and it has always stuck with me. So Walt Disney is walking through Disneyland one day, and as the story goes, and this little girl comes up to him, recognizes him, and says, Mr. Disney, do you still draw Mickey Mouse? And he goes, oh, no, I don't draw Mickey Mouse anymore. I have other people who draw Mickey Mouse. And she goes, well, what do you do? I mean, if you're not drawing Mickey Mouse, what are you good for? And he goes, I'm like a bee, a bumblebee. And I go from flower to flower, and I go from one department to another. And I'll pick up ideas in one department that's like the pollen of one flower, and I'll take it to another department, and I'll share what this department's doing over in this department. And I go from department to department to department. Well, that story works. I didn't have a group to lead. It was like, well, George, what group do you lead? I go, I don't lead a group. And I went from group to group to group while all the groups are going. And I could tell the groups that were going well, and I could tell the groups that were a little stuck and needed a little help. So I'd throw out an idea, and that would unstick them, and they'd keep going. And I kept doing that. And I go, this other group's talking about this idea, and I would pollinate that group with their idea. And then they'd go, oh, wow. And then they'd come up with more stuff, and or they'd go, or the leader would say, George, I'm not sure what you mean by this question here. And so I would mentor right there on the spot, mentor the whole group and mentor the leader. And the results were phenomenal.
Nice. That's a cool Walt Disney story. And that's like a perfect analogy for what a leader should be, is you're the connector between all of your departments, and you're just trying to facilitate your people becoming the best versions of themselves. And like, you're trying to just spread the pollen across so all the flowers in your organization can bloom.
And so the kind of the bottom line to the story is with Moses is he did make that decision. It's very, very clear in the story. He goes from like long lines out the door to talk to everybody to clearly in a moment, literally, he hears the fatherly advice and he says, yes, I will be that kind of man. I will share the load. And he does. And it changed everything from that point forward. So AJ, can you relate to any of this in your entrepreneurial experience?
Yeah, I definitely do relate to it, but I feel like that's a whole nother podcast unless we want to double up on this one.
All right. So guys, we will next week in the next podcast dig into real practical experiences we've had and, more rubber meets the road, how to apply this. Until then, may you live truly free.